In 1978, a four-door grocery getter humiliated every factory-backed pro-stock team in America. The National Hot Rod Association tore it down 4 times that season alone. They measured every dimension. They weighed every component. They found nothing illegal. But nobody, not even with the same parts, the same measurements, the same setup sheets, could make their car do what Bob Glidden's Ford Fairmont did. So the question remains, 45 years later, was Bob Glidden a genius who understood internal combustion engines at a level nobody else could reach? Or did he just cheat better than anyone else in the history of drag racing? By the end of this story, you'll have the evidence. You'll make your own judgment. But I'll tell you this right now, the truth is far stranger than either explanation alone. Welcome back to Regal Rides, where we dive deep into the most controversial, most legendary, and most misunderstood machines in automotive history. And today's story? This one sits at the top of that list. Let me paint you a picture. It's February 1978, the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona, California. You're a pro stock driver. You just spent $150,000. That's over $700,000 in today's money, building a purpose-built race car. You've got factory backing, a professional crew, and you're running a proven Chevrolet Vega or Plymouth Aero body that's won championships. You pull up to the staging lanes, and in the pit next to you is Bob Glidden, unloading a baby blue Ford Fairmont four-door sedan. The same car your grandmother drives to church on Sundays. The same car that's sitting in grocery store parking lots all across America right now, filled with bags of Wonder Bread and gallons of milk. It's tall. It's boxy. It has 4 doors, which means extra weight, worse weight distribution, and aerodynamics that should make it about as fast as a brick with wheels. The other drivers are literally laughing. Magazine photographers are taking pictures because it's so absurd. This is the car Ford Motor Company chose to compete against purpose-built Camaros, Vegas, and Aeros that have been refined over years of competition. Then the Christmas tree counts down. Green light. And Bob Glidden's grocery getter runs a 7.94-second quarter mile at 179 miles per hour. Your jaw drops. The crowd goes silent for a moment, then erupts. Because that 4-door church parking lot special just ran numbers that shouldn't be physically possible. Not for that body style. Not with that frontal area. Not with NHRA's strict pro-stock rules that were supposed to keep everything equal. You just got beaten by 0.3 of a second, an absolute eternity in pro-stock racing, by a car that looks like it should be hauling kids to soccer practice. And that was just the beginning. Over the next decade, Bob Glidden and that hated Ford Fairmont would go on to win 85 NHRA national events. 10 championships. They set 23 national records. They forced NHRA to rewrite the rulebook 4 separate times specifically to slow down this one car. They survived countless protests, full engine teardowns, and accusations that ranged from simple cheating to outright witchcraft. Glidden made grown men cry, made professional drivers quit the sport entirely, and once caused 8 of the top pro stock drivers in America to load up their trailers and walk out of the U.S. Nationals rather than compete against him. But here's where it gets really weird. Every single time NHRA officials tore down Glidden's car, and they did it constantly, sometimes after every single round, they found absolutely nothing illegal. Every part measured within specifications. Every component was approved. The engine displacement was legal. The weight was legal. Everything checked out perfectly. So how was he doing it? That's the mystery that haunted pro stock racing for an entire decade. That's the question that kept Warren Johnson awake at night. That's the puzzle that drove Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to solve. And that's the secret that some people believe died with Bob Glidden in 2018, taken to his grave because he simply couldn't explain in words what he understood in his bones. Here on Regal Rides, we've covered fast cars, controversial cars, and legendary cars. But this story combines all 3 into something that still divides the racing community today. Let's start with the most obvious problem, the car itself. On paper, the Ford Fairmont should have been the worst possible choice for a pro stock body. Pro stock racing in the late 1970s was all about aerodynamics and weight distribution. The ideal car was low, sleek, and shaped like a wedge to slice through the air. The Fairmont was none of those things. It was tall, significantly taller than the Chevy Monza or Dodge Challenger bodies that dominated the class. It had a massive frontal area, meaning more air resistance. The 4-door configuration meant the body was longer and heavier, with structural reinforcements in places that 2-door cars didn't need. The roofline was high and boxy, creating what aerodynamicists call a separated flow situation where air tumbles chaotically off the back of the car instead of flowing smoothly. Warren Johnson, one of Glidden's fiercest competitors and himself a future legend, called the Fairmont a parachute with wheels. Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins, the godfather of pro stock racing, said competing against it was like fighting a ghost. You can see it's there, but you can't figure out how it's beating you. Magazine writers called it the grocery getter that shouldn't be. Everyone agreed, this car should be slow. Everyone except Bob Glidden. But then people started noticing something strange. The Fairmont didn't sit like other pro stock cars. Most teams set their cars up with a slight rake, nose down, rear up, but within a narrow range that NHRA specified. Glidden's Fairmont looked different. The front end was slammed down dramatically. The rear was jacked up high. The car sat at such an aggressive angle that it looked broken, like the front suspension had collapsed. This became known as the Glidden lean, and it was the first piece of the puzzle. What Glidden had figured out, years before computer simulations became common, decades before pro stock teams had access to wind tunnels, was that the Fairmont's tall, boxy shape could actually work for him if he changed the angle at which it attacked the air. Think about an airplane wing. It's not the shape alone that creates lift, it's the angle of attack. Glidden applied the same principle in reverse. By raking the Fairmont nose down so aggressively, he accomplished several things simultaneously. First, he reduced the effective frontal area. When you tilt a box forward, you're presenting less of its face to the wind. Second, he forced air to flow over the top of the car instead of hitting the flat front end and tumbling chaotically. Third, and this is the genius part, he created downforce on the front wheels, which improved weight transfer during launch and made the car more stable at high speed. Other teams saw this. They measured the angle. They tried to copy it. And their cars became unpredictable, dangerous, or just didn't work. Some teams reported that their cars would become unstable above 150 miles per hour, wanting to swap ends or lift the front wheels. Others found that the aggressive rake hurt their 60-foot times, making launches slower. Glidden's Fairmont? Perfectly stable at 180 miles per hour. Launched like a rocket ship. Nobody could understand why the same setup worked for him but failed for everyone else. That was the first secret. Glidden understood that the Fairmont's weaknesses could become strengths, but only if every other element of the car was perfectly optimized to work with that aerodynamic setup. The lean wasn't a standalone trick. It was part of a complete system that Glidden understood and his competitors didn't. But the aerodynamics were just scratching the surface. The real secret was under the hood. While virtually every other Ford team in pro stock was running the Windsor small block engine, the same basic engine that powered millions of everyday Fords and had been refined for racing over decades, Bob Glidden chose the Cleveland 351. On paper, this decision made absolutely no sense. The Cleveland was heavier than the Windsor. Parts were harder to find. It had no proven track record in pro stock racing. Most engine builders considered it an oddball, a dead-end design that Ford had discontinued in production cars. But Glidden saw something others didn't. The Cleveland engine had canted valve cylinder heads, meaning the valves were tilted at an angle instead of vertical. This design created larger, straighter intake and exhaust ports. There was room for bigger valves. The combustion chambers could be shaped more efficiently. At high RPM, and pro stock engines were spinning at 9,000 to 9,500 revolutions per minute, the Cleveland could breathe better than the Windsor. Potentially. But potential means nothing if you can't unlock it. And this is where we enter the heart of the mystery, because Bob Glidden built every single one of his engines himself. In his own shop. With no employees. No helpers. No engine builders from major companies. Just Bob Glidden, alone with his tools and his knowledge. Nobody saw what he did. Nobody knew his processes. When NHRA officials tore down his engines during tech inspection, they found legal parts assembled in legal ways. But somehow, those legal parts were making 100 to 150 horsepower more than anyone else's identical components. Let that sink in for a moment. Other teams could buy the same cylinder heads from the same suppliers. They could use the same pistons, the same crankshafts, the same camshafts. They could measure Glidden's compression ratio, his valve timing, his port dimensions. They could copy everything they could see. And they'd still be 100 horsepower down. How is that possible? The accusations started almost immediately. Some competitors believed Glidden had developed secret port working techniques, that his cylinder head porting was so advanced and so perfectly flow-matched that it was essentially mechanical art. They claimed he spent hundreds of hours on each head, achieving flow numbers that others couldn't hit even with modern CNC porting equipment that wouldn't exist for another decade. Others swore he was using custom alloy pistons or special valve springs that would test legal during inspection but perform differently under actual race conditions. The theory was that he'd found materials or treatments that would pass NHRA's basic checks but provided advantages that wouldn't show up until the engine was running at full power. Then there were the displacement accusations. This was the most serious charge, the one that led to the most heated protests. Several competitors were convinced that Glidden had figured out how to run oversized displacement while making his engines appear legal during teardowns. They claimed he was using offset grinding tricks on the crankshaft, custom stroke combinations, or bore spacing manipulation that would give him extra cubic inches without being detectable through standard measurement techniques. These weren't baseless accusations from sore losers. These were coming from some of the best engine builders in the world, people who understood internal combustion engines at the highest level. Warren Johnson himself, who had a degree in mechanical engineering, couldn't figure out what Glidden was doing. Grumpy Jenkins, who had built championship-winning engines for decades, was baffled. So NHRA tore down Glidden's motors. They did it 4 separate times in 1978 alone. They pulled the engine completely out of the car. They disassembled it down to individual components. They measured the bore and stroke. They checked the displacement. They weighed the pistons. They measured the valve sizes. They inspected the cylinder heads for illegal modifications. They checked compression ratios. They verified that every single part met the specifications in the rulebook. Every single time, 100% legal. Not even close to the line. Not technically legal but suspicious. Just completely, totally, unquestionably legal. But the whispers never stopped. The protests continued. Because results don't lie, and Glidden's results were so far beyond everyone else's that it seemed to defy physics. Here's a specific example that illustrates just how dominant Glidden was. At the 1978 NHRA Spring Nationals in Columbus, Ohio, Glidden qualified number 1 with a 7.98. The next closest qualifier was at 8.17. That's almost 0.2 of a second, an absolutely massive gap in pro stock racing where hundredths of a second matter. In the final round, Glidden ran a 7.94 at 179.05 miles per hour. His opponent, running a proven Chevrolet Monza, ran an 8.14 at 171 miles per hour. 8 miles per hour slower. 0.2 of a second slower. With the same fuel, the same rules, the same NHRA officials inspecting both cars. It didn't make sense. So if Glidden wasn't using illegal parts, and he wasn't cheating on displacement, and his aerodynamics could theoretically be copied, where was the advantage coming from? This is where we get to the third secret, and it's the most controversial because it suggests that maybe, just maybe, Bob Glidden simply understood how to make an engine work at a level that his competitors couldn't comprehend. Let me tell you about Bob Glidden the person, because the car and the engine are only part of the story. Glidden was obsessive. Not in a casual way. Not in a he really cares about racing way. Obsessive in a way that bordered on madness, that drove him to levels of perfectionism that would be considered unhealthy in any other context. While other teams were celebrating victories or drowning their sorrows after losses, Glidden was in his trailer taking notes. He kept notebooks, dozens of them, eventually hundreds, filled with thousands of data points. Every pass was recorded. Air temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, track temperature, 60-foot time, 1/8 mile speed, quarter-mile time and speed, how the car felt, how the engine sounded, what gear he was in at the finish line. Then he'd cross-reference all of that data. He'd look for patterns. He'd notice that on days when the temperature was between 72 and 75 degrees and the humidity was above 60%, the car ran better with a specific spark plug gap. He'd realize that at tracks above 1,000 feet elevation, he needed to change his rear gear ratio by exactly 1/2 to keep the engine in its optimal power band. Other teams collected data too, but not like this. Not with this level of detail. Not with this obsessive cross-referencing and analysis. Glidden would change valve spring pressures between rounds based on air density. He'd adjust his clutch setup by thousandths of an inch based on how the track was prepped that specific day. And he never stopped testing. Most pro stock teams would show up on Friday, qualify on Saturday, race on Sunday, and go home. Glidden would rent tracks. He'd show up on Tuesdays and Wednesdays with a truck full of parts. He'd make a pass, change one thing, just one thing, maybe a different carburetor jet or a timing adjustment, make another pass, record the results, change something else. He'd make 30 passes in a day, and 25 of them would be slower than his baseline. But those 5 that were faster? That's where the advantage came from. That's the knowledge his competitors didn't have. Warren Johnson later said something that I think gets to the heart of this mystery. He said, Bob didn't have secret parts. He had secret knowledge. He understood how all the pieces worked together, how they interacted with each other and with the track and the weather, at a level the rest of us couldn't comprehend. It wasn't one big thing. It was 1,000 little things, and he knew all of them. Think about what that means. It means that even if you gave another team Glidden's exact engine, with every component identical, they still wouldn't be as fast because they didn't know how to tune it for the specific conditions of that specific day at that specific track. They didn't know which of the 1,000 variables to adjust and by how much. But that still doesn't fully explain the biggest mystery of all. Why nobody could replicate his success even after he showed them how. Because here's the thing, Glidden didn't keep all his secrets. NHRA's tech inspectors saw everything during teardowns. They documented his engine specs. They measured his suspension setup. They noted his gear ratios and his clutch configurations. Some of that information leaked out, officially or otherwise. Teams knew what Glidden was running, and yet they still couldn't match him. After Glidden retired from full-time competition in the late 1980s, several teams actually bought his old race cars. These weren't replicas or copies. These were the actual cars that Glidden had driven to victories, with his setups still in them. Teams hired former Glidden crew members, the few people who had worked closely with him. They thought they'd finally have the answers. They were still 2 to 3/10 of a second slower. There's a team that bought one of Glidden's championship-winning Fairmonts in the early 1990s. They didn't change anything. They ran the same engine specs, the same transmission, the same rear-end gearing, the same tire pressure. They had Glidden's old setup sheets. They went to a track where Glidden had run a 7.91, thinking they'd run something similar. They ran an 8.17. With his car. With his setup. At the same track. How is that possible? If the car and the parts and the setup were the same, why was it slower? The only explanation is that Glidden's advantage wasn't in the hardware. It was in how he operated the hardware. It was in the micro-adjustments he'd make based on conditions. It was in knowing when to shift, how hard to push the clutch pedal, how to stage the car to get the best reaction time while still getting maximum weight transfer. Even today, vintage Pro Stock Racing Series quietly ban 1978 to 1980 Ford Fairmonts from competition. Not because they're illegal according to NHRA's rules from that era. Not because they have unfair advantages built into the body or the chassis. They ban them because even as museum pieces, even driven by people who aren't Bob Glidden, they're still faster than they should be. The combination of that body, that engine platform, and that setup just works in a way that seems to defy normal engineering logic. Which brings us to the ultimate question, was Bob Glidden a cheater? Let's look at what we know for certain. NHRA never found anything illegal in any of Glidden's cars across hundreds of inspections over more than a decade. He passed every teardown, every measurement, every protest. When rules changed specifically to slow him down, he adapted and kept winning. He won with Fairmonts, then with Thunderbirds when NHRA banned the Fairmont body, then with Probes. He won with Cleveland engines, then with Windsor engines when Cleveland parts became unavailable. Whatever NHRA threw at him, he figured out how to overcome it. Modern analysis supports Glidden's claims. Engineers using computer aerodynamic simulations have modeled the Fairmont with the Glidden lean, and the numbers match his descriptions. It does work the way he said it worked. The aggressive rake does reduce drag and create downforce for that specific body shape. Fluid dynamics experts who've studied his cylinder head port work, looking at heads that were preserved in museums, say the quality is extraordinary but there's nothing magical about it. Just exceptional craftsmanship and understanding of airflow. Metallurgical tests on his pistons, valve springs, and other components show standard materials. No exotic alloys. No secret treatments. Just very precisely manufactured parts that were probably at the high end of production tolerances, but not outside specifications. Glidden himself addressed the cheating accusations many times over the years. His standard response was simple: I didn't have better parts. I had better combinations. And I was willing to work harder than anyone else to find them. There's a specific interview from 1982 where a reporter asked him directly, Bob, people say you must be cheating because nobody can be this much faster legally. What do you say to that? Glidden's answer is telling. He said, I say those people should spend less time complaining and more time working. I'm at the track testing when they're at home. I'm in my shop at midnight when they're sleeping. I take notes on every single pass when they make 3 runs and call it a day. They want to know my secret? The secret is there is no secret. It's just work. More work than they're willing to do. And you know what? There's evidence that he was right. The few drivers who came close to matching Glidden's success, Warren Johnson in the 1990s, for example, were the ones who adopted similar work ethics. Johnson started testing obsessively. He started keeping detailed notebooks. He started treating pro stock racing like an engineering problem that required thousands of data points to solve. And his performance improved dramatically. But here's what I think is really going on, and this is where we enter the gray area between genius and cheating, between working smarter and operating in the margins. Bob Glidden understood something that most people don't want to accept. In highly technical racing, the rules define a box, but they don't define the optimal solution within that box. Most teams built their cars to be safely within the rules, with some margin for error. Glidden built his cars to be exactly at the limit of the rules in every possible dimension. Not over the line, right on the line. He found every advantage that the rules allowed. He operated in the gray areas where the rulebook met physics. When NHRA said, displacement must not exceed 500 cubic inches, other teams built 498 cubic inch engines to be safe. Glidden built 499.9 cubic inch engines, measured to the absolute edge of tolerance. When rules said minimum weight is 2,350 pounds, other teams built 2,400-pound cars. Glidden built 2,351-pound cars and fought to get every ounce counted correctly. Was that cheating? Technically, no. Ethically? That's where people disagree. Did he bend rules? Probably. Did he find interpretations of rules that gave him advantages? Absolutely. Did he operate in gray areas? Without question. But did he break rules? Not in any way that NHRA could prove despite trying harder than they'd ever tried to catch any competitor in the history of the sport. Here's what I think is the real truth, the thing that makes Bob Glidden's story so fascinating 45 years later. Glidden forced the entire sport to evolve. Before Glidden, pro stock teams relied on intuition and experience. After Glidden, they had to use data analysis, computer simulations, and systematic testing. Before Glidden, teams could show up on race day and compete. After Glidden, you had to test constantly or you'd fall behind. Pro stock racing today uses wind tunnels, computational fluid dynamics software, data acquisition systems that record hundreds of sensors, and engine dynamometers that can simulate race conditions. Teams employ engineers with advanced degrees. They analyze telemetry in real time. All of that exists specifically because one man with a calculator and a notebook humiliated them for a decade. The baby blue Fairmont sits in a museum now, at the Wally Parks NHRA Motorsports Museum in Pomona, California. It looks slow sitting still. It looks like it should be in a shopping mall parking lot, not in a museum. But that car won 23 races, 3 championships, and changed pro stock racing forever. As for Bob Glidden's secrets, some people believe they died with him in 2018, that the knowledge in his head was so specific and so experience-based that it couldn't be transferred even if he wanted to share it. Others think his notebooks still exist somewhere, that his family has boxes of data that would reveal exactly how he did what he did. There are rumors that Warren Johnson has some of those notebooks, that Glidden gave them to him late in life as a gesture of respect between two competitors who pushed each other to greatness. But maybe the real secret was never in the notebooks. Maybe it was in the mindset, in the willingness to work harder than anyone thought was necessary, to chase advantages measured in thousands when everyone else was satisfied with tenths, to never stop questioning and testing and refining. So what's my verdict? Was Bob Glidden an engineering genius or a cheating legend? I think he was both, and I think those things aren't as different as we want them to be. He was a genius who understood that the rules created opportunities for people smart enough and dedicated enough to find them. He was a legend who operated in the margins, who pushed boundaries, who made people question what was possible. And yes, he probably bent some rules and definitely broke some spirits. But he never got caught. Not once. Not in hundreds of inspections. Not in a decade of dominance. Either he was the greatest cheater in racing history, so sophisticated that the best tech inspectors in the world couldn't catch him despite trying desperately to do so, or he was exactly what he claimed to be. A guy who worked harder and thought deeper than everyone else. The baby blue nightmare destroyed pro stock racing, but it also saved it. It forced the sport to become more professional, more technical, more sophisticated. Every fast pro stock car today carries a little bit of Bob Glidden's DNA, whether the teams want to admit it or not. And that four-door grocery getter? It's still the most controversial, most hated, most successful, and most mysterious pro stock car ever built. 45 years later, We still don't fully understand how it was so fast. Maybe we never will. But that's what makes it legendary. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of racing's greatest mysteries, make sure you're subscribed to Regal Rides. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me whether you think Glidden was a genius or a cheater, and stick around because we've got more controversial automotive stories coming your way. This is Regal Rides, where we don't just tell you about cars, we tell you the truth about cars. I'll see you in the next one.